"You'll never amount to anything." My stepdad told me that for 20 years. Then he needed my signature. My name is Vanessa. I was 10 years old when my mother married Walter, a man who ran a mid-sized construction and logistics company he'd inherited from his own father, a business that had been operating in our town for nearly 40 years by the time he and my mother met. My biological father had left when I was 4, moving to another state entirely, and by the time Walter entered our lives, I barely remembered what having a full-time father figure felt like. For the first several months, Walter seemed steady and capable in ways that felt genuinely reassuring to a 10-year-old who'd spent years watching her mother struggle alone. He fixed the garage door that had been broken for over a year. He showed up to a school open house within weeks of moving in, shaking hands with my teacher like he'd known her for years. I remember feeling briefly like our family had finally found solid ground. Walter brought 2 children of his own from a previous marriage into our household, my stepbrother Trevor, who was 12 at the time, and my stepsister Paige, who was 8. In the earliest months, the 4 of us navigated the new household reasonably well, the way children often do before the adults around them begin drawing lines that eventually become impossible to ignore. Those lines appeared gradually over the following years, so gradually that I couldn't identify a single moment where things shifted, only a slow accumulation of small signals that, by the time I reached 13 or 14, had become an unmistakable pattern I could no longer explain away as ordinary sibling dynamics. The differences surfaced first in small, almost forgivable ways. Walter began bringing Trevor to the company's job sites on weekends starting around age 11, teaching him about the business hands-on, introducing him to foremen and clients as the future of the company long before Trevor had any real understanding of what running a business actually required. When I expressed interest in learning more about the company myself around the same age, genuinely curious about the world Walter spent so much time in, he told me it wasn't really something girls needed to worry about. A comment that landed strangely even at that young age, especially once Paige, several years later, also showed interest and received the exact same dismissal, despite Trevor's continued, expanding access to every aspect of the business. I remember one particular incident during my 6th grade year, when I'd worked for nearly 2 months on an ambitious science fair project studying local water quality, staying after school regularly to use the chemistry lab, genuinely proud of the work I'd put into it. When I placed first in the regional competition, beating out students from 3 other schools, Walter's response at dinner that evening was a brief, "That's nice," before pivoting almost immediately to a lengthy discussion about a bid Trevor had helped him prepare for a new contract, praising Trevor's contribution at considerable length despite Trevor being only 14 at the time and having done little more than fold papers and hand Walter a calculator. By high school, the pattern had become impossible to explain away as anything other than what it clearly was. Walter attended every single one of Trevor's wrestling matches throughout his entire high school career, driving considerable distances for tournaments, celebrating wins with dinners out as a family. He never once attended a single one of my cross-country meets during my 4 years running competitively, despite me finishing among the top runners in our regional conference by my junior year, despite my mother asking him repeatedly to consider coming to at least one race. My mother came whenever her work schedule allowed, standing alone at the finish line some Saturdays, but Walter's absence became such a reliable pattern that I eventually stopped expecting anything different, stopped feeling the particular sting of disappointment that had characterized my earlier years in that household. I remember, during my sophomore year, coming home with a report card that included 2 A+s and a personal note from my English teacher describing my writing as some of the strongest work I've seen from a student at this level. Walter glanced at the report card for perhaps 10 seconds before setting it down and asking whether I'd considered taking business courses instead, since writing doesn't pay the bills. That same week, when Trevor brought home a report card with mostly B's and C's, Walter took the entire family out to dinner to celebrate Trevor's solid effort, a phrase that stuck with me uncomfortably for years afterward, given the stark contrast in how our respective achievements had been received within the same 7-day period. My mother tried, within the constraints of her marriage, to counterbalance Walter's clear favoritism, showing up consistently to my events herself, praising my accomplishments enthusiastically at home even when Walter remained indifferent, quietly finding ways to celebrate milestones he dismissed. But my mother worked part-time as a receptionist at a dental office, and Walter controlled the family's larger financial resources entirely through the business, Resources that flowed consistently and substantially toward Trevor's future in ways that became increasingly explicit as we all grew older. By the time Trevor turned 18, Walter had already begun formally training him to eventually take over daily operations at the company, paying him a salary well above what an inexperienced 18-year-old would typically earn anywhere else, framing it as an investment in the family legacy. When I turned 16, unlike Trevor, who'd received a truck from Walter as an early 18th birthday gift specifically tied to needing reliable transportation for job sites, I was told plainly that I'd need to earn my own car if I wanted one, since Walter felt it would build character I might otherwise lack. I worked through the rest of high school at a local bakery, saving carefully, eventually buying a modest used car myself at 17. An accomplishment that gave me genuine pride even as I understood exactly what message lay underneath Walter's decision to treat Trevor and me so differently in that particular area of our lives. The comment that would define the next 2 decades of our relationship first appeared during my junior year of high school, during a conversation about college plans at the dinner table. I'd mentioned interest in studying business administration, genuinely excited about a summer program I'd been accepted into at a nearby university, hoping perhaps this shared interest might finally build some bridge between Walter and me. Instead, he responded with something close to indifference, telling me that pursuing business without any real path into an actual business, meaning his business, which he'd already earmarked entirely for Trevor's future, seemed like a waste of time and tuition money. When I pressed, asking what he thought I should do instead, he said almost offhandedly that I should keep my expectations realistic, that not everyone was cut out for real success, and that he worried honestly that I'd never amount to much of anything if I didn't find a more practical path forward. I remember sitting at that table, 16 years old, absorbing a sentence that would echo through the next 20 years of my life in various forms, repeated during arguments, dropped casually into conversations about my choices, always delivered with the same maddening tone of resigned, matter-of-fact certainty, as though he were simply stating an obvious fact about the world rather than making a deeply damaging prediction about a teenager who happened to share his household but not his blood. College applications became another quiet battlefield. Trevor never actually applied anywhere, since Walter had made clear years earlier that the company would be his path forward regardless of formal education. Paige, several years younger, would eventually follow a similar route into the business once she came of age. When I began researching universities during my junior year, genuinely excited about several strong business programs I'd found, Walter told me that if I insisted on pursuing college rather than finding practical work, I'd need to fund it entirely myself, since the family's resources were committed elsewhere, a decision he delivered without much apparent internal conflict. I did exactly that, working through my senior year with a relentless focus that surprised even me, applying to every scholarship opportunity available, eventually earning enough combined aid and small scholarships to attend a respected state university with manageable debt, an achievement Walter acknowledged with a brief "good for you," before immediately shifting the conversation toward Trevor's expanding responsibilities at the company that same week. I left for college at 18 with a complicated mixture of relief and grief. Relief at finally escaping a household where I'd spent 8 years being quietly, consistently told, in both words and actions, that I would never measure up to expectations Walter had never actually extended to me in the first place. I studied business administration with genuine dedication, driven partly by real interest and partly, I'll admit honestly, by a stubborn need to eventually prove Walter's 20-year prediction wrong, whatever it cost me to do so. I graduated with honors and a concentration in finance, immediately taking an entry-level position at a regional investment firm, a job I approached with an intensity that occasionally worried my mother during our weekly phone calls, though she never discouraged the drive itself, understanding I think exactly where it came from. Walter's reaction to my graduation was a brief congratulatory text, the same pattern he'd maintained throughout my entire life, offering minimal engagement dressed up as adequate acknowledgement. He didn't attend the ceremony, citing a scheduling conflict with a company event that, as I later learned from Paige, could have easily been rescheduled had he genuinely wanted to attend. I built my career over the following decade with a focus and discipline that consistently surprised colleagues who hadn't yet learned my full history. I moved from that initial entry-level position into progressively more senior roles, eventually specializing in corporate restructuring and business valuation work, a field I found myself drawn to partly because it required exactly the kind of clear-eyed, unsentimental analysis that came naturally to someone who'd spent her entire childhood learning to see family dynamics with unflinching honesty. By 30, I'd been recruited into a boutique consulting firm specializing in helping family-owned businesses navigate ownership transitions and financial restructuring, work that, in a twist I didn't fully appreciate until years later, would position me with exactly the expertise Walter would eventually desperately need. Throughout those years, I maintained a careful, distant relationship with Walter, attending holidays primarily for my mother's sake, keeping conversations brief and surface level, the emotional guardedness I'd developed throughout childhood serving me well in an adult relationship that never quite managed to become anything warmer than polite tolerance. Trevor, meanwhile, had fully taken over daily operations at the company by his late 20s, running the business alongside Walter with an ease and confidence that reflected years of hands-on mentorship I'd never once received, despite growing up under the same roof. I met my husband, Adam, at 29, through a mutual colleague at a conference neither of us had particularly wanted to attend that week. He worked in commercial real estate, sharp and grounded in ways that immediately put me at ease, someone who listened with genuine attention rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. Adam's family, warm and consistently engaged in ways I'd rarely experienced growing up, welcomed me with an openness that took considerable time for me to fully trust, having spent so many years learning that familial warmth often came with hidden conditions attached. We married when I was 32, a smaller, quieter wedding than some, held at a garden venue with close family and friends, one where Walter, notably, offered only a brief, generic toast before quickly returning to his seat, a pattern so consistent by that point that it barely registered as disappointing anymore, simply confirming what I'd long since accepted about the relationship. My career continued advancing steadily in the years following our wedding, and by 36, I'd been made a full partner at my consulting firm, specializing specifically in helping family businesses navigate exactly the kind of generational transition and financial restructuring challenges that, unbeknownst to Walter, his own company was quietly approaching. The years leading up to what eventually happened were marked by warning signs within Walter's company that I only pieced together gradually, largely through occasional, careful conversations with Paige, who had joined the business in an administrative role several years earlier and who, unlike Trevor, had begun developing genuine concerns about certain financial decisions being made at the leadership level. The construction industry in our region had grown considerably more competitive over the previous decade, with larger regional firms undercutting smaller family-owned operations like Walter's on major contracts. Trevor, despite years of hands-on experience, had never developed the kind of financial and strategic sophistication the business increasingly required to remain competitive, having been groomed almost entirely around operational knowledge rather than the broader financial literacy the changing industry demanded. Paige mentioned to me, during a rare, candid phone call about 18 months before everything came to a head, that the company had taken on significant debt to bid competitively on several large contracts. Debt that had become increasingly difficult to service as two of those contracts fell through due to circumstances partly outside the company's control. She mentioned carefully that Walter had grown increasingly stressed and secretive about the company's finances, unwilling to discuss details even with Trevor, who nominally ran daily operations but who Paige suspected didn't fully understand the severity of the situation developing beneath the surface. I want to be honest that I felt conflicted hearing this information, some part of me recognizing, uncomfortably, a flicker of something like vindication at the idea that Walter's carefully built legacy, the one he'd spent decades constructing specifically for Trevor while dismissing my own potential at every turn, might be facing genuine trouble. But a larger part of me, the part shaped by my own professional discipline and, honestly, by whatever residual loyalty remained toward my mother's marriage despite everything, felt genuine concern about what a company collapse might mean for my mother's financial security, given how thoroughly her own retirement planning had been tied to Walter's business success over the decades of their marriage. The situation finally reached its breaking point roughly 8 months ago, when Walter's company defaulted on a significant loan payment tied to equipment financing the business had taken on 2 years earlier to compete for larger contracts. The bank holding that loan, after months of missed or partial payments, initiated formal proceedings that put the company's operating assets, including several major pieces of equipment essential to ongoing projects, at serious risk of seizure within a matter of weeks unless a restructuring agreement could be reached quickly. I learned about the severity of the situation not from Walter directly but from my mother, who called me one evening sounding more frightened than I'd heard her in years, explaining that Walter had finally confided in her about the company's financial crisis, admitting that decades of work and a significant portion of their own personal retirement savings tied up in the business were now genuinely at risk. She asked hesitantly whether I might be willing to simply talk to Walter, given my professional background, understanding how complicated that request was given everything that had passed between us over the years. I agreed to meet Walter, primarily for my mother's sake, though I'll admit a professional curiosity played some role as well. The kind of clinical interest that comes naturally after years spent analyzing exactly these types of business crises for other families. Walter and I met at his office, a building I hadn't set foot in more than a handful of times throughout my entire adult life, despite Trevor having essentially grown up within its walls. He looked considerably older than I remembered from our last extended conversation, visibly worn down by months of mounting financial pressure he'd apparently been managing largely in isolation. He explained the situation with a kind of clipped, uncomfortable formality, laying out the loan default, the equipment at risk, the broader debt structure that had accumulated over several years of increasingly aggressive bidding meant to keep the company competitive against larger regional firms. He'd consulted with an attorney and a business advisor already, he explained, and both had suggested that a restructuring plan, involving renegotiated loan terms alongside a partial equity restructuring within the company itself, represented the company's best remaining path forward, one that could preserve the business and protect the equipment from seizure, but one that would require unanimous agreement from all current shareholders to move forward. It was at that point in the conversation that I learned something I hadn't previously known, something that reframed the entire situation and explained, finally, why Walter had reached out to me specifically rather than relying entirely on Trevor and his own attorneys. Nearly 15 years earlier, during an earlier, smaller financial rough patch in the company's history, my mother had quietly used a portion of an inheritance she'd received from her own parents to help stabilize the business during that period, a fact she'd never mentioned to me directly, understanding perhaps how complicated it might feel given everything else happening within our family at the time. In exchange for that investment, Walter had formally granted my mother a minority equity stake in the company, a stake that, under the terms of their marriage and existing estate planning, would eventually transfer partially to me as well, a detail buried in paperwork I'd genuinely never known existed until Walter explained it that afternoon in his office. That minority stake, small as it was, meant that any formal restructuring of the company's ownership and debt structure legally required my signature as a shareholder, alongside my mother's and Trevor's, before the bank or any outside investors would agree to move forward with the proposed rescue plan. Walter, sitting across from me in that office, explained this reality with an expression I'd genuinely never seen from him before, something between reluctant necessity and a barely concealed discomfort at having to ask me, of all people, for something he genuinely needed. I want to describe honestly what that moment felt like, sitting across from the man who had told me, in one form or another for 20 consecutive years, that I would never amount to anything, now needing my signature, my professional judgment, and ultimately my willingness to cooperate, in order to save the very legacy he'd spent decades building specifically for someone else. There was a complicated satisfaction in that moment, one I won't pretend didn't exist. But there was also, underneath it, a genuine recognition of how much was actually at stake, not just for Walter but for my mother's financial security, and for Trevor and Paige's futures as well, neither of whom bore responsibility for the dynamic Walter had created between us over the years. I told Walter I'd need to review the actual financials myself before agreeing to anything, a request that visibly surprised him, though he agreed readily enough given how limited his remaining options actually were at that point. Over the following 2 weeks, working alongside my own team at the consulting firm, I conducted a genuinely thorough review of the company's financial position, the proposed restructuring terms, and the broader viability of the business moving forward under new terms. What I found was more complicated than Walter's initial explanation had suggested, revealing not just the immediate loan crisis, but years of underlying inefficiencies and missed opportunities that Trevor's operational focus, without the broader financial strategy the business genuinely needed, had allowed to accumulate largely unnoticed until the crisis finally became impossible to ignore. I requested a meeting with Walter and Trevor together, the first time the three of us had sat down for a genuinely substantive conversation about the business in my entire adult life. I laid out my findings clearly and professionally, the way I would for any client, without the emotional undertones that might have colored the conversation given our history. I explained that the proposed restructuring terms Walter's attorney had negotiated were workable but not optimal, that with some additional adjustments I could help negotiate, the company could emerge from the crisis in considerably stronger financial shape than the original plan would have achieved. Trevor, to his genuine credit, listened carefully throughout that meeting, asking thoughtful questions despite what must have been a difficult experience. Watching his younger, largely excluded stepsister demonstrate a level of financial sophistication about his own company's operations that he'd never developed himself despite years of hands-on involvement. At one point he admitted quietly that he'd always assumed operational knowledge alone would be sufficient to eventually run the business successfully, and that watching me analyze the company's actual financial structure so thoroughly had made him realize, uncomfortably, exactly what gaps existed in his own preparation for the role Walter had spent decades grooming him toward. Over the following month, I worked alongside Walter's attorney and the bank's representatives to renegotiate several key terms of the restructuring plan, using both my professional expertise and, I'll admit, whatever leverage came from being a necessary signature on documents that couldn't move forward without my formal agreement. I secured better interest rate terms than the original proposal, structured a more sustainable repayment timeline given the company's actual cash flow patterns, and notably, insisted on formal governance changes that would give Trevor access to genuine financial mentorship moving forward, changes I felt were essential not for my own benefit, but for the long-term survival of a business that still, despite everything, employed nearly 40 people from our local community who depended on it for their livelihoods. The formal signing of the restructuring agreement took place roughly 6 weeks after that initial meeting in Walter's office. All of us gathered around a conference table alongside Walter's attorney and a representative from the bank. I signed my portion of the documents alongside my mother and Trevor, formally completing the agreement that would allow the company, and everyone whose livelihoods depended on it, to move forward on considerably more stable footing than had seemed possible just weeks earlier. After the formal signing concluded, as the bank representative and attorney gathered their materials to leave, Walter asked if he could speak with me privately for a few minutes. We stepped into a small side office, and he stood there for a long moment before finally speaking, his usual composure noticeably absent. He told me haltingly that he owed me an apology that was long overdue, not just for asking for my help during this crisis, but for 20 years of consistently, casually dismissing my potential in ways he now recognized, watching me navigate this entire situation with a level of skill and composure he genuinely hadn't believed I possessed, as deeply unfair and genuinely damaging to our relationship over the decades we'd shared a household and eventually a family. I told him honestly that I appreciated him saying that it mattered considerably more than he likely realized after 2 decades of silence on the subject. But I also told him calmly and without anger that helping save the business wasn't really about him specifically, that I'd done it for my mother's financial security, for the employees whose jobs depended on the company's survival, and if I was being fully honest, for Trevor and Paige, who deserved a stable foundation moving forward regardless of the complicated history between Walter and me personally. In the months following the restructuring, my relationship with Trevor shifted considerably, evolving into something more genuine than the polite distance that had characterized our entire shared childhood and young adulthood. He began reaching out periodically for informal advice on financial decisions within the company, conversations that gradually built into a working relationship I never would have anticipated, given the vastly different levels of investment Walter had made in each of our respective futures throughout our childhood. Paige and I grew closer as well, our earlier occasional phone calls evolving into a more consistent friendship built on the shared experience of navigating that particular family dynamic from different, though overlapping, vantage points. My relationship with my mother deepened considerably during this period as well, an honesty emerging between us that hadn't previously existed, largely because I'd spent years protecting her from the full weight of my own complicated feelings about Walter, understanding intuitively how much guilt she already carried about the marriage and the choices it had required of her over the decades. We talked for the first time, honestly, about the inheritance she'd used to help the business all those years earlier, about her own complicated feelings watching Walter build an entire vision of the future around Trevor while consistently dismissing my own potential, feelings she admitted she'd never fully voiced even to herself, until watching everything unfold during the restructuring crisis. Walter and I have continued speaking more regularly in the time since, cautious but genuine conversations that occasionally touch on business matters, given my continued minority stake in the company, but that have gradually expanded into something closer to an actual relationship than what existed throughout the previous 2 decades. He attended a professional recognition dinner. I received an award at roughly a year after the restructuring concluded, sitting quietly in the audience alongside my mother and Adam, a small gesture that meant considerably more to me than he probably realized, given everything that had and hadn't happened between us throughout the decades leading up to that evening. I think often about that sentence, repeated so many times throughout my childhood and young adulthood that it had become almost background noise by the time I reached my 30s. You'll never amount to anything. He said it to shape my expectations downward, to steer me toward a smaller, more limited version of my own future, one that conveniently required nothing further from him in the way of investment, mentorship, or genuine belief in my potential. What he never understood, not until he genuinely needed my signature to save everything he'd spent decades building for someone else entirely, is that being consistently underestimated doesn't necessarily break a person's drive. Sometimes, quietly and gradually, it simply builds it into something considerably more resilient than anyone watching from the outside might have expected. I never set out for revenge in any of this, not in the aftermath of that first conversation in Walter's office, not throughout the weeks of financial review and negotiation that followed. I only wanted to do the work honestly and thoroughly, the way I've approached every professional challenge throughout my career, understanding clearly what was genuinely at stake for everyone involved, not just for the man who'd spent 2 decades quietly predicting I never would. If someone important in your own life ever told you that you'd never amount to anything, shaping your own expectations downward in ways that took years to fully recognize and unwind, I'd genuinely like to know. Did those words eventually break something in you? Or did they become, the way they eventually did for me, the exact thing that quietly built the determination you needed to prove otherwise on your own terms in your own time?